Chapter 8: The Phillips Curve, the Natural Rate of Unemployment and Inflation. In Chapter 7, you saw that, in the medium run, the economy returns to the natural rate of output associated with the natural rate of unemployment. Chapter 8 looks more closely at the relation between inflation and unemployment, a relation known as the Phillips Curve. In the short run, behavior of inflation depends on the deviation of unemployment from the natural rate. In the medium run, unemployment returns to the natural rate independent of inflation. Inflation is determined by money growth in the medium run. Learning objectives: explain what the original Phillips curve illustrates. Based on the aggregate supply relation, explain what factors determine inflation. Understand what two factors caused the original Phillips curve to vanish. Understand the Phillips curve when expected inflation depends on last period's inflation rate. Learning objectives: define the natural rate of unemployment and explain its determinants. Recognize that the natural rate of unemployment varies across countries and over time. Figure 8-1 shows that during the period 1900 to 1960 in the United States, a low unemployment rate was typically associated with a high inflation rate, and a high unemployment rate was typically associated with a low or negative inflation rate. The figure shows the findings of Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow for the United States based on a study done by A.W. Phillips in 1958 for the United Kingdom, showing a negative relation between inflation and unemployment. Samuelson and Solow labeled this relationship the Phillips curve, and it became central to macroeconomic thinking and policy. It appeared to imply that countries could choose between different combinations of unemployment and inflation. Based on the aggregate supply relation, we can understand the factors that determine inflation. Equation 8.1, which restates the AS relation you saw earlier in equation 7.1, says price level P depends positively on the expected price level PE and negatively on the unemployment rate U, where alpha measures the strength of the effect of unemployment on the price level. Equation 8.2 shows us the relation between inflation, expected inflation, and the unemployment rate. It says inflation rate pi depends positively on the expected inflation rate pi E, markup M, and the catch-all variable Z, and negatively on the unemployment rate U. Equation 8.3 attaches a time subscript to the variables inflation rate, expected inflation rate, and the unemployment rate to specify the value of these variables in year T. M and Z do not have time subscripts because we are assuming those values to remain constant as we look at movements in inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment over time. Equation 8.4 is the equation for the original Phillips curve. It is derived from equation 8.3, where expected inflation rate is set to 0 because during the period that Phillips, Samuelson, and Solow studied, average inflation and hence expected inflation was 0. Prices rose in some years and fell in others, so people essentially on average expected them to remain unchanged. Equation 8.4 shows the negative relation between inflation and unemployment. Basic mechanism at work was the wage price spiral. Low unemployment leading to higher nominal wages leading to higher prices leading to workers asking for higher nominal wages, and so on. Figure 8-2 depicts that the steady decline in the U.S. unemployment rate throughout the 1960s was associated with a steady increase in the inflation rate, showing how well the Phillips relation held during the long economic expansion that lasted throughout most of the 1960s. Figure 8-3 shows, beginning in the 1970s, the relation between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate disappeared in the United States. Points are scattered in a cloud showing no visible relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. This happened for two reasons. One, oil prices increased twice in the 1970s causing inflation to be higher for each given level of unemployment. And more importantly, 2. Wage setters changed the way they formed expectations. Instead of assuming that price level would remain unchanged from year to year or that expected inflation would be zero, they started taking into account the presence and persistence of inflation, which had been the case in the US starting in the 1960s. This changed the nature of the relationship between unemployment and inflation. Figure 8-4 shows that since the 1960s, the US inflation rate has been consistently positive. Inflation has become more persistent. Equation 8.5 says expected inflation rate in year T depends on the actual inflation rate in the previous year. The value of the parameter theta captures the effect of last year's inflation rate pi t minus 1 on this year's expected inflation rate pi et. The higher the value of theta, the more last year's inflation leads workers and firms to revise their expectations of what inflation will be this year, and so the higher the expected inflation rate is. The value of theta was 0 during the time period when average inflation was 0, the time period studied by Phillips, Samuelson, and Solow, giving us the original Phillips Curve relation. From 1970 onward, the value of theta increased from 0 to 1, giving us equation 8.6, which shows that unemployment rate affects not the inflation rate, but rather the change in the inflation rate. High unemployment leads to decreasing inflation. Low unemployment leads to increasing inflation. Equation 8.6 gives us the relation called the modified Phillips curve or the expectations augmented Phillips curve. This relation was observed for the period 1970 to 2010 and is given by the equation 8.7. It shows a negative relation between the unemployment rate and the change in the inflation rate. Suppose unemployment rate increases from 5 to 6%, then change in inflation rate will go from 0.55 to 0. That is, increase in unemployment will lead to decreasing inflation. We see this by substituting the different unemployment rates in equation 8.7. Note, original Phillips curve says increase in unemployment rate leads to decrease in inflation rate. Modified Phillips curve says increase in unemployment rate leads to decreasing inflation. Figure 8-5 shows since 1970 there has been a negative relation between the unemployment rate and the change in the inflation rate in the United States. You can see for low unemployment the change in inflation is positive. For high unemployment the change in inflation is negative. The history of the Phillips curve is tied to the discovery of the concept of the natural rate of unemployment. According to the original Phillips curve, there was no such thing as a natural rate of unemployment. Unemployment could be lowered forever if the policymakers were willing to accept a higher inflation rate. In the late 1960s, Friedman and Phelps argued theoretically that unemployment could not be lowered beyond a certain point. If the government tried to lower the unemployment rate beyond that point, the trade-off would disappear. The trade-off works as long as wage setters systematically underpredict inflation, and they were unlikely to make the same mistake forever. The 1970s proved them right. The natural rate of unemployment is defined as the rate such that actual price level is equal to the expected price level. Thus, the actual inflation rate is equal to the expected inflation rate. Substituting pi t equals pi t minus 1 in equation 8.3, we get equation 8.8, which gives us the formula finding the natural rate of unemployment in the economy. It shows that the higher the markup m, or the higher the factors that affect wage setting z, the higher the natural rate of unemployment un. Higher value of alpha leads to a lower natural rate of unemployment. Equation 8.9 is derived from equation 8.3 by rewriting the terms so as to give us an important relation between change in inflation and the deviation of unemployment from the natural rate of unemployment. Equation 8.10 is obtained by using the information that the expected inflation rate in year t is equal to the inflation rate in year t minus 1. Equation 8.10 gives us two important relations. 1. The change in inflation rate depends on the difference between the actual and the natural unemployment rates. And 2. The natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment required to keep the inflation rate constant. That is why the natural rate is also called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NARO. Equation 8.11 restates the AD relation from Chapter 7, Equation 7.3. Equation 8.12 says that in the medium run, since actual inflation must equal expected inflation, unemployment rate must be equal to the natural rate. So the natural rate of unemployment is independent of the growth rate of money. At the natural rate of unemployment, output is equal to the natural level of output, Yn. If the natural rate of output is constant, then M over P, the real stock of money, must be constant given G and T. This gives us an important relation shown by equation 8.13. In the medium run, rate of inflation pi is determined by the rate of money growth Gm. Milton Friedman famously said, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." Factors such as the monopoly power of firms, strong unions, strikes, fiscal deficits, and increase in the price of oil do affect the price level and by implication do affect inflation in the short run. But unless they affect the rate of money growth, they have no effect on inflation in the medium run. Figure 1 shows unemployment rates in 15 European countries in 2006. In 2006, inflation was stable in all those countries, suggesting that the actual rate was close to the natural rate. You can see that the natural rate of unemployment varies across countries. The figure shows that it was very high in France, Spain, Germany, and Italy, and very low in Denmark, Ireland, and the Netherlands. It also varies over time. For example, in the United States, the natural rate of unemployment was 7% in the 1980s, but only 5% during the period 2000 to 2007. Table 8-1 shows the behavior of inflation and unemployment from 1979 to 1985. Inflation, as you can see, was very high in 1979. To bring it down, Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, implemented contractionary monetary policy to slow down the economy. Unemployment had to be higher than the natural rate by just as much as equation 8.10 predicted. A word of caution, though, must be heeded. According to the Lucas critique, people do not form expectations about inflation only by looking to last year's inflation rate. People are forward-looking, and they will form expectations by taking into account the effects of any policy measures that have been announced. In such a case, the cost of disinflation would be lower. Thomas Sargent suggested that if monetary policy was credible, you could achieve disinflation without any increase in unemployment or at a very small cost. Also, at very low or negative rates of inflation, the Phillips Curve relation appears to become weaker.